All right. Well, welcome everybody back to our monthly new day and time. Sorry for the confusion that some of us might have had last week as we pivoted to this week. But I'm appreciative for everybody being here as we continue our discussion of what does neuroscience look like in the helping professions. And we're lucky to be joined by Doctors Purkey and Burt today to have what they would like to be formatted as more of a podcast style discussion around their article and their work um, in ways that we might not perpetuate scientific racism in the research and the application of neuroscience in the counseling field. As a reminder, I will send out a continuing education link at the end of the hour. So if you're here, then you can fill that out. And then we'll stick around for another half hour of unguided musings if you all would like. But the CE formal part will be 1 hour long. So with that, Doctors Purkey, Burt, would you all just like to, I don't know, say something about yourself, who you are, and why the heck you're here today?
Sure. Dr. Purkey, do you want me to go first or are you?
It doesn't matter. You could go ahead and go first.
Okay, I guess we'll go in alphabetical order. My name is Burt. I am an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. My research interests, clearly, if I'm here, you know, some of my research interests correspond with neuroscience and counseling. But to be succinct, I look at I say historically disenfranchised and marginalized populations. I look at the intersection or integration of neuroscience or biological principles of behavior with multiculturalism. I also look at infusing neuroscience into group work and also looking at creative aspects of counseling. And I'll just kind of speak very, very quickly about the impetus that brought me here, and then I'll let Dr. Purkey go, and then we'll kind of delve into this and trying to give you all what I call, what I tell my classes sometimes, a little sneak peek into what we're going to talk about. But one of the things that I found unsettling is that when we talk about like science and neuroscience does fall into that, we look at it as totally objective. And part of the aspects that I see, especially over the years and with my own clients, is that science, even though we try to claim aspects are objective, there's still a cultural component to it. I joke with my class, and I'd say that you have a cultural aroma that you take with you everywhere that you go. And sometimes that cultural aroma mixes with other people's cultural aroma, and it can sometimes smell good or sometimes smell a tad bit of, nasty. So we have to take steps into understanding one another. And science does have this cultural aroma that has decades, if not, I don't want to say millennia, but at least decades of work behind that we do need to recognize that there are scientific principles, but they do have cultural aspects to it that we do need to take into consideration, especially when we look at applying it to in such a widespread fashion with populations that may have different ways of approaching it, which we'll talk about later on today. But look, I to be perfectly honest, it's in the semester. I'm so used to talking, I have to cut myself short here. So I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Purkey and have her introduce herself.
Hi, hello everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is my first experience with Brainstorm, so thank you, Dr. Besson, Dr. Burt, for this opportunity. I got my PhD in cognitive neuroscience in 2021. A lot of my research focused on representation and methodology of people that look like me in the field. What I noticed a lot in the effects of psychosocial factors such as like racism, discrimination, and how that impacts the brain and overall well-being. Um, Isaac and I connected. He was on my dissertation committee, had a lot of fun work. My dissertation focused a lot more into the specifics of PTSD and how the brain is affected by PTSD. But I got this opportunity to do some of this research with Isaac, create this really awesome paper on how we can merge other fields that I'm lacking a lot of knowledge in, but so excited to talk about today, which is in counseling. And so it's been a pleasure. And right now, I am a user experience researcher at State Farm. So I've pivoted out of academia for a little bit, but I have been pleasurably enjoying my time there at State Farm. So pleasure to meet you all.
And I have been trying, and she has been begrudgingly refusing my attempts to bring her back into academia, which I totally understand. But I just had to add that there, Dr. Purkey.
Oh, I love it. And we'll have new kinds of experiences to share. And, you know, even if you're a State Farm employee, Dr. Pankey, you're still invited anytime you just want to unpack a little bit about neuroscience and helping professions, and really neuroscience and how we live our lives as people, as clinicians, researchers, etc. And I think as I reread your all's article this morning, I kind of started to have a half-baked image in my mind of maybe what I took away as the thesis of the article being, if the soil is polluted, then everything that grows out of the soil probably has that own taintedness, call it the aroma that Dr. Burt said. And if we're passing those, let's call them fruits and vegetables around, then they might carry that with them to a group that it might not make sense with. And I think the call to action that I heard was this idea that that's been present in all of research, and it's also present in this new vein of neuroscience research. So here we have this opportunity to not replicate those same challenges in the future. And I heard that as kind of one of the calls to action. Do you think I got that close, Doctors Pankey and Burt, or what would you add to kind of that thesis that I took away from it?
I'll go ahead, Dr. Pankey.
Yeah, no, I think you did a really good job, Dr. Besson. And yeah, I just think for me, this is really exciting. We have a gap. There are things to kind of address in how we interpret science and understand science. Um, just from my knowledge and understanding with neuroscience, um, racism is a big problem. And people that look like me are often left out. And so when we're thinking about what health outcomes mean, how they impact who we are from a cultural perspective, we're missing out on that, right? And so, of course, I'm very passionate just because of my identity, my intersectionality as a Black woman, but it's very, very, very crucial to really be thinking about how this can tie all these different pieces together.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback off that, I like how you use that metaphor, and that metaphor is quite accurate. I like metaphors too, and sometimes I wonder if we should do research on metaphors and the impact on the brain, but that'll get me on another digression. But what you said is really important, and I just want to add that what I was saying earlier about science being objective, there is that cultural component to it. We look at things such as you said about the fruit and it being tainted. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the apology that APA did. I think it was about 2021, around 2020, 2021. It could be off a year or so. But that was really important because what they were talking about was scientific racism and looking at the denigration of people of color over a period of years, with explicitly or implicitly. And what I'm getting at is that when we talk about just say like neuroscience or just biological principles, I think it's simple to say biology does scale. Because if you're going to concentrate on something, there has to be some form of neurotransmitter, norepinephrine in the system. Yes, but how do we get there? That's where the culture aspect brings into account. And to give a concrete example, part of the impetus for doing this was that we look at this biological neuroscience research and then come to a conclusion. But how did we get there? What were the mechanisms that brought us there? When I looked at a lot of the research, and my wife has recently, because she has to because we moved, so she has to we're going to another state, so she has to take a couple more classes. And she's been looking at a lot of the scientific racism because she's Latina. She's like, wow, I mean, I see all these deficit-based approaches. And she said, I don't really see that as being representative. And I'm saying that because that's what really piqued my interest when I was looking at the neuroscience aspect. I've always had that biological basis of behavior kind of inclination, but when I was looking at results, I'm like, this just doesn't measure up. It doesn't measure up not just to my experience, but also my client's experience. And I see just a lot of work, and it says things like, okay, Black populations have high cortisol, hypertension, heart attack. And it's like, wow, I'm really messed up. I didn't realize I was so jacked up, and I guess there's just no help for me. And I'm like, well, hold on. I mean, I'm relatively healthy. I mean, I see people relatively healthy. It's taken out of context. It's not taken into account. Perhaps there could be a high degree of cortisol, but if you don't take into account the racism, the mechanisms of how people get there, you can denigrate once again by having this scientific deficit, so scientific racism looked at on our population and saying, well, I guess it's just genetic. I guess just being born, because then I see stats as well, just being born Black gives you a something % chance. Excuse me, I think of water here. And so when Dr. Beeson, when you talked about having this tainting, it was like, yes, and we need to take a step back and to make sure that we aren't kind of just spreading the disease. And I'll give another concrete example. When I said biology scales, like, yes. If you're having a hard day, let's say I have kids and my kids are out of control, they're kicking up dust, running up the walls, literally doing backflips. I got 5 manuscripts that need to be done. I have 25 students, and my life is chaotic right now. So you would say, as having a neuroscience background, well, you need to get control over your, maybe your neural context, your neural processes. How do I do that? Okay, well, I know that we know on a biological level, cortisol needs to reduce. Perhaps we need to have some norepinephrine. I can concentrate on something, maybe get some serotonin, some aspects, but how do I get there? And I feel like that's the missing component. Culture provides the means. Biology will provide the result. Clearly, yes, we're all related, 99.9% according from my understanding. But the methods, the culture of how we get there are going to be quite different. And what I see lacking is the cultural components that provide the mechanisms. For instance, my way of getting my neural processes under control could be having a cup of tea with my wife. It could be praying. It could be meditating. The cultures, I mean, of so many different, I'll say this, the practices, excuse me, of so many different cultures can help individuals, but we tend to just look at it through a very monocultural perspective. And that's what really gave me the impetus to really go further on this and then correspond with Dr. Purkey here. And because she is a straight up neuroscientist, while I am a counselor educator with a predisposition for biological processes, with Dr. Purkey and we met back, I think, 2018, 19, Dr. Purkey, if my memory serves me correct. It was before COVID.
A long time ago. Now, I guess.
I mean, now everything's pre-COVID, post-COVID. So it was pre-COVID. And then we just started talking, and I said, I'm really infatuated by the neuroscience aspects. And so I just, once again, I'm in academia. I just finished the semester. I just finished teaching Monday. So I'm still in this mode. So I'm going to take a step back and just ask if you have any more questions just on what we spoke about thus far, or if Dr. Purkey, you want to add or chime in on anything that I just stated.
Yeah, I like to think of it as like an ecosystem, right? We're all these different individuals, we're all these different people, we're pulling in all these different experiences. And the landscape of that ecosystem is affected by pollutants like racism, like sexism, like being marginalized, right? And so just to piggyback off of what Dr. Burt is saying, we have to find a way to address those pollutants and find a way to better protect this ecosystem. Like if the ecosystem is the brain, we're all kind of coordinating together. How are we going to continue to do that? And so that's where I think kind of counseling comes into this aspect, and neuroscience being combined together. where they can address that and address some of these pollutants that we have. You know, and just from a historical context, when we think about neuroscience, stress, cortisol, big factor that's always being released when we're in these high stress, intense situations, and we're seeing that that is wear and tear on our brain over time. And so when in different parts of our brain, um, from the sympathetic adrenal axis to our amygdala to our frontal cortex, and how we are making executive decisions on how we respond to these stressors. So it's very crucial to kind of like use that information as like that springboard to help better merge these two topics together and consider you know, multiculturalism in this. Like, we can't ignore that we are all very different here in this country that we're living in, and our experiences matter. And so, how can we amplify that and make sure my experience is heard and matter, right? So, like for instance, if I have definitely experienced medical racism, going to doctors that did not take my pain seriously. We know with Black women, when it comes to labor, there's a lot of issues. So, what are the ways and how? And I feel like our paper really kind of thinks about how we can really truly integrate that and have applicable practices into neuroscience, into counseling, with a specific focus on, you know, Black populations. But that's not limited to Black populations either. I'll say that. But that's the unique experiences of me and Dr. Burt. So we write from what we know.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback, I think that Dr. Purkey, you said something really poignant where talking about the wear and tear on the brain. I mean that's allostatic load, and but the things that really throw me off is that we know these biological concepts, and we're quite familiar with the idea of allostatic load, but we don't take it into consideration when we think of working with clients, because you're absolutely right. You're in pain. You go to the doctor. You're in pain. Good gracious, that's bad enough as it is. But then when you add in the extra factors to take into consideration of like, okay, they're not taking me seriously. How come they're not taking me seriously? Is it because I'm short? Is it because my hairstyle? Is it because I'm Black? Is it because did I sound funny? I mean, all these extra things, and then especially when you think it's because I'm a woman. I mean, the intersectionality, but then the research doesn't take that into consideration. It just talks about in a very general, well, allostatic load is just the wear and tear on the body and brain. I'm like, well, yeah, but then we don't actually take the cultural components and merge it into the research to actually study that, to say, yes, allostatic load is real, and the culture that an individual is in can compound on that. And just, I don't want to go too much on a tangent, because I know that's not the whole point of this conversation, but it does compound the situation and exacerbate it. Sure, please go. Dr. B said, I don't want to take your role. I know you're the moderator, so go ahead.
Okay. So you just taught me a bunch of stuff, but specifically, I think this is cultural. When you referred to the moment when you tell yourself, hey, they're not listening to me, they're not taking me seriously, that's a step up from what I've experienced, which is what they're saying doesn't match what I'm saying. They have degrees in stuff. Maybe they're older than I am. And when I was a lot younger, it was, and they're men, therefore I am wrong. It was an automatic, like somehow I put more automatically, when there was a difference, when there wasn't, when I wasn't being listened to or agreed with, even about my own kids sitting around the IEP table with all these PhDs, and I wasn't a counselor or anything. It's like, well, I guess they must know. And I think that can, it's getting better now, but I think that can spread in a whole culture of people can believe what the people in power, shall we say, what they tell us.
Yeah, is it Dr. Rudman?
No, it's just Laura.
Okay, well, Laura. Well, and I do, I want to make sure that I give Dr. Purkey equal time, but you just said something that I just want to take a moment just to discuss. When COVID-19 hit, I do think I am a man of science. I am a man of science, and I would hear people say, "Well, I don't trust this," and I would hear some, Black people state, "I don't trust it," and I'd be like, "Come on, like, because as you said, the experts tell you something, and then a lot of the literature I was reading was like, oh my goodness, Black people are dying by the thousands here. We need to get this." And then, I took a step back and thought exactly about what you said. In my own distrust, I have this love-hate relationship with science. I really enjoy, I don't want to use the word love. No, I only use love for my family, but I really enjoy science. You take me to a science museum or give me something new that's science related, and I'm just, oh my goodness, I'm just enamored with it. But I also have this concern of going into like science fields, just what the reaction to me may be. And even like Dr. Purkey said, going into the medical aspects of going into with a doctor. And I'm saying that because I would hear some people say, well, I don't trust the system. And there is a historical aspect to that, from the HeLa cell to some of the Tuskegee experiments. I mean, there is a history, even in modern day, about women being experimented on in prisons, that women of color being experimented on so they couldn't have children. And so you're right. The first reaction you get, it can be cultural, it can go here and here, but it's the compounding of it. It's the continual experience where you start, well, okay, am I being gaslit or is something awry here? Like I'm getting the same experience through multiple people. And what is the one commonplace thing with multiple people? It's you. And so either I'm talking to these people crazy or they're responding to me because of some phenotypical aspect or some type of characteristic of my personality. So I think you're right. At the beginning, people feel that, but once you've had a multiple account of experiences that are very similar with different people, and then you start kind of piecing things together and saying, I'm not quite sure that they have all the rules. And that's when you start, like I said, with COVID-19, people say, well, I don't want to do it. But then you're ostracized because you're like, well, don't you see the media? We're dying by the thousands here. We really need to, which we need to admit, a lot of times research with race is actually conflated with socioeconomic status, which is a big thing that I don't know we have the time to go into with that. But I just think, Laura, you brought up a very poignant point, and I just want to just elaborate on that. But Dr. Purkey, I want to pass the virtual mic to you so you can chime in as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point, Laura. Like, it's just, I look at it as, science is evolving, and what we once know and knew is being challenged in how we understand, how we take in information, how we treat others. And so, with that evolution, I think there's like some growing pains. So, like, we're having a tough time, redefining our future based off of the past. And I'm not saying that we need to forget the past, because the past has grounded us into what we believe, what Dr. Burt is saying, what I'm saying. But the point is, we can acknowledge both. And I think that's where we have this kind of struggle when it comes to our health and well being and our experiences. The other thing I'll say is, I appreciate this space now because I think it all starts with conversation. And we might hold some biases and perceptions. I'm able to listen. Dr. Burt is able to listen and be open, and it's not judgmental. It's not from a grounds of just putting our lens on it, but like that's where I think we've got to continually try to improve and make more of these culturally open spaces for us to really talk and understand. And the last thing I'll say is, Laura, I think I heard you mention where, you had this expert opinion and then like you're wrong, right? And so like imagine like how that makes you feel and how we feel when that happens. So I'm not a big fan of saying the word wrong, because what is right versus what is wrong. But I think it's more or less about morality of what is good and what have we learned from our mistakes, you know? So I don't want to go on a whole tangent, but that's how my reaction is to your comment, because I see and empathize with what you're saying.
There's a lot of richness that we've already unpacked, and I want to try to tie together two of these themes. Like the one is this idea of early lack of representation in research leading to models, theories, interventions that are then applied. And then when people are recruited into research, it's coercively done without informed consent and has created a sort of spirit of mistrust that kind of perpetuates things. So I want to maybe take a little bit of a history lesson into my life as a reformed cognitive behavioral theorist. So you all know Albert Ellis, right? You know the theories, right? His theory model developed out of a predominantly weird population, as we would call it, Western, educated, rich. You all know the weird acronym, I hope, and if not, I'll share a follow-up resource to it after this. So developed out of that mindset. Along the same time, there's a gentleman by the name of Maxie Maltzby who's creating rational behavior therapy that really doesn't get into a lot of the textbooks. And something you all wrote about was silencing of Black authors, Black theorists. And I think that's an example of people that were developing very similar ideas at the same time. One got a lot of popularity, one did not. And how many people have heard of Maxie Maltzby in their counselor education program? Again, one of the precipitating factors, I would say, of REBT developing along that same time. But nonetheless, so let's imagine Eric, early in his career, very rigid cognitive behavioral theorist, and Dr. Purkey comes in expressing that they've had this terrible interaction with their doctor, and Dr. Purkey, you believe that you're not being taken seriously, that this doctor is looking down upon you and all of these things. And what would the purest cognitive behavioral therapist, Eric, in his early career try to do with Dr. Purkey? Any guesses? What would I try to do?
Perhaps you would try to reframe.
Oh, I would say, is that really what happened, Dr. Purkey? Can we look at what was really going on? What would a camera show in that situation? Right. So there's this inherent sort of, and I think to me, that's where that, if the soil's tainted, maybe the fruits and vegetables also get tainted, because without, I think, a cultural appreciation, and I would say, respect for multiculturalism and a history of traumatic experiences that are related to that racial experience, then we run the risk of really perpetuating that in really harmful ways. So for me in my own journey, I think that's a big point of self-reflection of, like, early in my career, I would have been super susceptible and probably did it, unfortunately. And I think now, how did Eric come to be that way? Because as you all have advocated, that's the way the research was conducted and written. And unfortunately, we've perpetuated that in our practice and our future writings too. So I just want to say that I think it's a really poignant example of kind of how that can be perpetuated in everyday practice without us even knowing it. I think we would be doing CBT the way we were trained and maybe not even know about how did that experience come to be that way? And Dr. Burt, I think you said that really well. We forget that question about how did it come to be that way? And even in this mistrust conversation, imagine two headlines. We might see one headline that says, Black people experience medical distrust. And then we might have another one that says, scientific racism creates medical distrust. Those are two different headlines talking about a similar experience, but I think one that focuses on this deficit mentality that says Black people are flawed, and another that focuses on the conditions that created that mistrust. And I think, Dr. Burt, what you were saying about that sort of, that where did it come from, what mechanisms brought us there, is a hard thing to restructure in my own brain when I read research. Because we clickbait, we look at the abstract, and we see, oh, African Americans scored twice as high on this scale. That must mean that they are this way, rather than the question of how did those scores come to be that way. And I think that's really a hard thing for my brain to restructure. So I think when you wrote that art, I'm going to be a little self-disclosure. When you wrote that article, it was a really great reminder to me to do more work in that direction. So I will peace out for a minute. If I could, Laura, if I could give it back to Dr. Spanky and Burt for a minute, and then we'll jump on to you.
Well, I'm okay with Laura if
Okay.
it's Dr. Pink, I want to ask you if that's all right too. I mean, I do have a bunch of things I want to say, but if it's a question that or a comment that has connection to it, I feel I can give you the floor. I mean, we can give you the floor there to address it, Laura.
My
I'll
ears.
make it quick. Dr. B, speaking of the young Dr. Beeson, what I learned, my primary job is to have self-awareness.
Mhm.
That is the basis for what I do. And what you just demonstrated, ironically, is that you were practicing that, but nobody tells us that our self-awareness is really limited. Nobody tells us where to look and what rocks to look under, to even have our own self-awareness. And we all think, I mean, we learned it in schools, and that's what we do, and we think we have it. And as you demonstrated even earlier, when you didn't notice that you had made assumptions, based on things you read and stuff. And self-awareness, I think, is so much more complicated than we give it credit for. We think we know ourselves, and even if we're really, really smart and we really, really put a lot of time and attention to it, and we're brave and we look for the bad stuff, we've got to be open to finding out that there's more that we don't know about us.
I think you bring up and what you said actually does connect to something that I wanted to speak about too, and this is a good segue into that, is that we are biological creatures or entities, whatever terminology you want to utilize. But we're also spiritual creatures. And I'm just not talking about, oh, you believe in Christianity, but if you believe in nothing, well, that's your spiritual aspect. We're also social creatures as well. And in part of I keep using this word impetus, but it really was, I mean, it really is, I don't say was because I'm still currently doing that, is that especially with a Western model, which has its benefits, but we do compartmentalize these different aspects of ourselves. And even though we talk about in counseling, I just use counselor education as an example, we talk about holistic. But in my experience, as a master's student, as a doctoral student, and as a clinician, and then finally as an educator or an academic, we don't do that. We do compartmentalize. We state this part, but we don't look at how the biological can connect to the spiritual, and how the spiritual can connect to the cultural, and how the cultural can connect to the biological. We just look at one section. So when Laura, you said, oh, we don't really know ourselves, I think because that's how we're trained. We're trained to compartmentalize. And I can speak, I'm not sure my age here, but Eric, I think we're similar in age. I know when I was in my master's degree, you could not talk about religion. I mean, like, it was like, I remember our supervisor said, what do you say? God is too big for that room. Because when we had the earplugs, the bucket in the ear, and a client started talking about Jesus, it was like, nope, Jesus too big for that room. Get them back on, as you said, CBT. Get them back on their thoughts. And clearly, the culture of counseling changed, so we can now, in a way, speak about it, but it's still very limited. In a lot of instances, And then it went to clearly the client can initiate it, then it was kind of okay. And now we can inquire somewhat about that to get more information. But you can see how it's very compartmentalized because spirituality was not looked at as being a big component. But we know now from tons of research that spirituality part is very important and critical to people's biological processing. And clearly the spiritual part has a cultural component to it. And so I don't want to go too far off on this, but I think you bring up a very valid point. And I would hope that the future researchers, the future counselor educators, the future clinicians can take this aspect and say, you know something, if I'm looking at 3/4 of, or not 3/4, excuse me, I'm looking at a quarter of my client. Well, what about the other 75%? Like, what steps do I need to do as a clinician, as a researcher, to incorporate this and not just put this to the wayside? And so I think this is perhaps the future of counseling. At least I would hope that's how I'm teaching my students, to really have, even if it's just pedestrian understanding of the biological precepts, yes, but then finding out what are the spiritual aspects and what are clearly the cultural aspects, so you can make sure that you're fully operating as much as you can in a truly holistic manner, and not just saying, well, because I understand what they ate last night, which people don't really do, but I sent them off to a nutrition and now they know about chrononutrition. Great. I'm holistically working with my client. I feel like there's more to that. So but I do want to, like I said, I just finished teaching this last week, so I'm in teaching mode. So I need to curtail it and give it to my partner here, Dr. Purkey. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
You said that very well, Isaac. I really don't have anything to add to that specific comment, and I'm just learning a lot about counseling in general. Dr. Besson, when you were giving that example of your younger days and when you were working with me, I'll take it a step further where if, for example, you wanted to reframe my thinking and put the onus, on how I'm understanding things, then that makes me feel a little bit more, uptight. Well, is it me? Am I the problem? I'm really reassessing, or invalidating. Am I getting gaslighted? So it's like one of those feelings of, that really stuck into my mind when you were giving that example. So I agree with Dr. Burt wholeheartedly. We really do need to think about these intersecting ideas and ideologies and how they can really be applicable in the counseling field. But I know very little about counseling, so I'll preface with that. But I've been learning so much from this conversation today of reframing into thinking in this particular discipline. So thank y'all for that.
Lynn, you've had a few comments in the chat. I'm wondering if you might bring some of those into the room, because I think it gets at one part of a question I hope to talk about today, which is, what is race and how do we define race in our research? That was something a former Brainstorm participant challenged us on, and was actually their work trying to figure out, what are we actually trying to measure in our research? So Lynn, do you want to bring that up? What you were saying in the chat box?
Sure. And pardon me, I just put some long comments in there. Just about, distinguishing between what we view as race versus what is actually the product of racism, which is the structure and how it's policed. The hierarchy of white supremacy and how it is inflicted upon people, and just how there's such a history in quote unquote rationalist Western science of pseudoscientific theories about race and ascribing all these different physiological characteristics to different racial groups, and all of it is totally bunk. And I feel like there's just some risk of repeating that when we do research where we just break people down into demographics and don't name what is caused by actual kind of like genetic lineage. Like, we know certain diseases, are kind of more common with some people from certain geographic locations, and that is real, and we are discovering some of that. But then other results, it just seems like it risks repeating this kind of certain people are just broken, right? Or certain people are just inherently unhealthy, or these outcomes. And it's like, is that actually because of you know, some innate characteristic of race, or is it because of the experiences of oppression? And I just feel like sometimes just naming demographics hides the actual harm that's happening, and kind of goes back to that pseudoscientific, like, racial essentialism, instead of naming the structures and the processes and the experiences of oppression that are actually causing it. And it's like, no one actually wants to name the elephant in the room. It's easier to just name people's characteristics, because that's something that this kind of pseudoscientific white supremacist vein of science has been doing for a long time, rather than naming the processes that people live under that produce some of these outcomes. But also then sometimes we don't know, perhaps with certain health outcomes, what is genetic, what is epigenetic, what is a result of lived experience. I think some of this is also unexplored. And I don't have the answers to any of these things, but I think about it a lot.
Yeah, I just want to, well, first I want to sit with what you said, Lynn, and I think that's really important. And when I was reading what you put in while you were talking, and you brought that idea of racism, not race. I've seen that so many times in articles that talk about exactly what you're referring to. That I say so many times, but I guess in my research, I don't see it. I don't see it disseminated a lot, but in the research that I do see it, and it does state that simple idea. Racism, not race, is the point of these things, not necessarily the genetic flaws, the inherently genetic flaws that populations have. And so I agree. And if I could give just this one example, and I will erase names so people won't have any of that information. But I was sitting on a hiring committee, and there was an individual that did work in the Latino population. And my wife is Mexican, just to kind of preface this. And the bulk of what their study showed was that when specifically Latino immigrants come into the United States, is when they assimilate and they give away their cultural aspects, they do much better. Even though that wasn't exactly what they stated, it was the crux of their work. And they had one term in there that was called, and I'm probably butchering it, but it's called Maria Nisma. And basically, it's the idea of the woman taking on too much, like the saint, like Mary, or the Virgin Mary. And or Saint Mary, sorry, Saint Mary. I know this will be recorded, so I wanted to make sure I get everything accurate. And when I was talking to my wife, she was like, I never heard of that concept. That's an American concept. I never heard of that before I came here. Because that type of resilience is praised in the native country. And what I'm saying from that is what I hear you also stating, Lynn, the culture dictates what is the norm. Because the idea is like, I didn't know I was crazy until I came here. And all of a sudden I have Maria Nisma. And I think the idea of what this individual was trying to put forward in their work, I don't think they were mean-spirited. I think they were conceptualized with the culture of you need to assimilate in order to become well. And I believe what you're saying, Lynn, is it's pseudoscience. It is. I mean, it's a term that doesn't exist anywhere but the States when I'm specifically talking about Maria Nisma. But that can be attributed to almost any population that doesn't correspond with a Eurocentric perspective in the helping profession. And so we can denigrate, we can make up terms that then become doctrine that we then do research on and then add more information and search for the work that then says, well, look at it. Look at this. I found the research that says this is true. It gives the evidence. And then we find more research. And then we have research that goes against it. We say, well, that we're not quite sure about that. Like that goes against what is the norm. So I just think you brought up a very important factor, and that is the crux of what I wish to do, to really show a different perspective. Like even looking at, and I don't want to go too far from tangent here, but looking at indigenous practices, specifically when you look at psychedelics, not to go too far on a tangent, but I'll try to make this short. Indigenous populations have been utilizing psychedelics for centuries, literally. But now there is psychedelic research and there is psychedelic counseling. I mean, there's psychedelic therapy. I know I've written on that, but it takes it away from the roots of it and makes it more of a modality without giving the kudos to the original population that it came from and the cultural setting of it. That's why there's so many bad trips, as they're called now, because they're missing the idea that it's missing that cultural component. And so I just think you bring up a very important factor here about how this pseudo racism or pseudo science is predicated by racism, not necessarily race. So very important part there. But once again, I'll pass this to my partner here, Dr. Purkey. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh yeah, I just want to say, like, Lynn, that was a great call out because that was often on my mind, especially your first comment about pseudoscience and scientific racism. We know, like, in the neuroscience field, there was phrenology in craniology where they were justifying, different sizes of our actual skull are related to Black people versus white, and that really upholds a lot of racism and white supremacist views. So yes, I think that we often have a lot of disillusion around race as a construct versus racism, which is the process as a result of that construct. So that was a very good point that you had brought up, that it was on my mind. And the other thing that I just wanted to kind of circle back and think on too is not to treat culture as a monolith in thinking of how we define processes that affect us. Because I often think about, with Black people, the umbrella of being Black gets tied into a lot of things that don't always coincide with each other. I mean, we can talk about, chattel slavery, a lot of us having roots from Africa. Some of us believe that. Some of us were indigenous here. But to be looped into that one particular experience of just being Black or being African American or being Caribbean, all these different kind of factors, we have to keep in mind that we have to be careful when we're thinking about cultural too. Like, it's not just a monolith within it. So I hope that made sense. I'm trying not to ramble, but that's just something that really came to my mind, Lynn, when you spoke and had your comments in the chat.
And Lynn, that really kind of reminds me of some reading I did at one point that was sort of challenging the idea that even using terms like multiculturalism and things like that are at times an attempt to sterilize things and make it feel like, oh, that's a good thing we should try to work towards, rather than, acknowledging the hardship of slavery or a specific kind of oppression that's not sterile and different to talk about, I guess, than just saying we want to be multiculturally competent counselors and things like that. So I think that idea of sterilization has been something I think in science we do when we operationalize a term. Like we say, oh, now we're going to study medical mistrust in marginalized populations. Like, and that's my line of research. I'm going to try to get rid of medical mistrust without kind of a full throated kind of exploration of how do we address the system that created the medical mistrust in the first place, and how do we create interventions around that system. And I think, Lynn, your comments followed by what Drs. Purkey and Burt said really kind of drives home that point of reminding myself again that to not just focus on the fruit that grows out of the ground, but focus on the soil that's underneath of that fruit and think about what do we need to do as a people, as a profession, when we're thinking about our research, and we're thinking about the research that we read. And I think that's the other key part is how am I reading this research and what conclusions am I making from it, maybe implicitly, because it might not always be the authors perpetuating the ideas. We might just have that implicit conditioning to see X person is this way because they scored higher in this scale or whatever. And I think that's something that's hard to uncondition, that calls to action like this are so important to do. And I see neuroscience as being far more susceptible for many, many reasons, which I won't go into right now because of that. I think, Dr. Burt, how you started, kind of that perception that it is more objective, that it is more whatever, that it has more of a primary function in the way we experience the world. So I think that risk is even more paramount. Dr. Burt, you're going to jump in.
No, I just, man, I know I'll try to be succinct here, but I just want to piggyback off what you stated. I think that's so important, just the research itself and what I mentioned before about the objectivity. I was reading a study and this was a couple of years ago and I don't remember exactly the dynamics of the study, but it had something to do with neurological, biological, drug use. It was something around that. And I was reading and I went to the results and I was reading it and I'll just give you a quick summary. It said something of like, oh my goodness, like 35% of white people, I think they may have said Caucasian, but 35% Caucasians, and it was something bad, like blah blah blah, did bad things to themselves. And then it had something of like 50, I'm sure I get my math, 38, so maybe 52% of, or 52 or 62% of people of color did the bad things to themselves. And then I was like, okay, and I read it, and I'm like, oh no, just didn't read right. So I read it again, and I was like, well, hold on. What they did in this was like, yes, you talk about biological principles. This group had more than X group had more than Y group. So it's like, well, it's indisputable. I mean, like clearly they had more of this bad neurotransmitters in their body, XYZ. But then when I thought about it, I was like, well, hold on. It's just using white people as one category and then just throwing in non-white or people of color. I said, well, that's Black, that's Latino, that's Asian. I mean, like, and then within those, I mean, you got Latino, those could be Mexicans, could be from El Salvador. I mean, it could be from Cuba. I mean, then, I mean, Asian, I mean, it could be from Jakarta, it could be Chinese, Japanese, Chinese. I mean, it could be, AAPI, Samoan, it could be from Fiji. And I was like, good gracious. I was like, that, I mean, so the white group may have been higher, but the way that it was read and the way that it was put forward was like just comparing one group to like kind of how Dr. Purkey said, just this chimera of other ones. And so I just think that that's something that we have to look at when we're looking, and that's what scientific racism does. I don't think these individuals were trying to do that, but when we look at like cross comparison, we just have the white group, which is supposed to be like the ultimate group, and then everybody else. And it's okay to kind of throw everybody else in the same boat because, I mean, they're not white. And so I feel like that's a fatal flaw that we take implicitly. Because if I was to do a study and it was just on Black males, and then I was like, well, Eric, it's good for you too. You're like, well, hold on, maybe not. I mean, like, I'm not a Black guy, but it doesn't matter because it was on men. And so, but that would be looked at as like, oh, that's shoddy research, Dr. Burt. But that's really what we do. And we take that as a given that it's okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just kind of end it with that one for me.
Yeah. We've allowed the quantitative proliferation of research to perpetuate that, because why do we do that? Because we need equal sample groups to run certain statistical analysis. So what do? We don't have enough in every group, so we group them all together so we can compare them to the other majority group in the study that shares a more similar representation. So I think that's where part of the, I hope I've seen some movement in showing more credibility for qualitative methods, more credibility for small sample size, more monolithic samples that aren't meant to be representative of everyone. They're meant to be representative of that small, distinct group of people. So I think it's really nice to see some movement in what we accept as reputable research, I guess, that can free us up from some of those statistical barriers that I think previous research has forced us into. We've allowed to be put into those boxes, if you will. Dr. Purkey, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna say too, you know, in research, we focus on positive bias. So what the significant findings are when there are things that might not be statistically significant in whatever way that we define statistical significance, that are just as meaningful or things that approach statistical significance. See me putting in these quotes a lot. Yeah, it's just we need to be mindful of that too in our research because you know, Isaac, you're mentioning in that article, and it's just focused to me on what was significant, but what are the other factors? And I don't know, I think you probably might have had that in the article, but what are the other factors that are driving some of those findings? You know, yeah, they're in this other group, but why are they considering them in this one monolithic other group? And then what defines this monolithic other group? Like you mentioned, socioeconomic status, poverty, um, income, family household income, all these different kind of things that are automatically associated, you know, with this group that is other, that is non-white, that we have to be very, very, very more mindful of in how we interpret our results.
There's a one example of even if you do that grouping statistically, I think we oftentimes are more likely to say white versus non-white, but we could very easily say BIPOC versus non-BIPOC or some other thing, even though that would still be flawed statistical methodology as we're talking about. You could still decenter whiteness as the point of comparison if we wanted to. That's still not going to get us where we want to go. But I think it represents the centralization of the perspective that designs the research and interprets the results. And I've probably written an article at some point that has done that. And I think that's part of the self-awareness piece. That's part of the accountability piece. That's part of the, I guess, commitment to do better and not replicate it in the future piece that we're all here to keep moving on. I know some people might have to go. Doctors Purkey, Burt, do you all need to go or do you want to stick around for a little longer?
I can stick around for a bit longer.
Yeah.
Same.
Okay. I did want to ask, because I think we're really getting into, when we had a previous person that talked about operationalizing race, as I mentioned, and like some of his writing, there were neuroscience journals that debated for a while whether they should even report on race in research studies because they feared biological determinism. They feared that people would make improper conclusions from some of the research. So for a long time, they thought about just getting rid of it altogether. They didn't go in that direction, but that was an option that was on the table for some neuroscience journals. And I think where I think what this author suggested was like we really need to operationalize what we mean by race and focus on the variables that we want to focus on. Is it socioeconomic status? Is it an intersection? Is it something else? So I'm just curious, like as you think about designing studies, is it possible to cover all of the components related to the experience of race, or do we need to get more specific and focus on experiences of racism or something else as the actual variable that we're including in the study? I'm just curious your all's thoughts of how a fledgling researcher might design a better study and include better variables to actually study what we want.
Okay, I don't know. Can I go? I know I know we're finished with but that is something that I really talk somewhat about, and I'll just put my 2 cents into this. I mean, I don't think we should throw the baby away with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is that every research is limited. The things that we put for limitations, sometimes when I'm reading research, I'm like, is this really a limitation, or are you just stating this because that's what's been traditionally put forth for your statistical analysis, for your research design? Like, what are the real limitations of your work? The real limitations is that you're trying to do something from a case study and apply it to everybody else. Yeah, okay, yeah. But at least the good aspect is that we get to see what you do, and then we can sit there and modify it. When you have a very large quantitative study that has like 457 people in it, I mean, clearly the problems that I see is that you have something with 457 people in it and it doesn't apply to your normal Joe. And it's like, well, if it has such a strong power, how come it doesn't, apply to your normal Joe or Joe S? I mean, it's just like, wow. So like what I'm thinking of what you're saying is that we don't have to throw the baby away with the bathwater. We can acknowledge the power, the intricate aspects of the research design, but state like, well, it may not be. And so researchers need to take caution instead of having this kind of carte blanche type of ideas like, well, it's been published, it's good for everybody. We should use this. And I utilize CBT as that because I know it's the gold standard in counseling. But I struggle with that when you have people who were, I think it was Lynn who stated about looking from an American or Westernized view. And from my understanding, when it comes to statistics, I think like that type of view or population is only 5% of the world's population. So that means, well, maybe it could be 5 to 10. I don't know. Don't quote me on this, but I know that it's somewhere between that. And so then how are we utilizing what's just one for 5% of the population for the other 80 to 90? And so like I feel like just acknowledging that and then saying what are steps you could have taken to make it more. And then acknowledging, which I think a lot of research is doing, is acknowledging your own biases from the research. So you're not objective, just the scientific view, the scientific perspective that you have as your inclination, which is your bias. So I feel like we don't have to recreate the wheel. In some instances, we may need to recreate the wheel. So I don't want to say that we don't need to change anything, but I feel like baby steps, small steps can lead up. And then yes, there may be a complete rehauling of different aspects, but that's how I try to address my research and how I try to help my students address it as well. Like, don't give me these status quo limitations. Like, tell me what you really think this study lacked and its application. So I'll leave it at that, but I did just want to state that because I feel like that's something that I try to put forth when I'm doing my own research and speaking with people too.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to what Dr. Burt is saying, for me, I think a few things kind of come to mind. One, I don't even know, like, from a neuroscience perspective, how to operationalize race. I think these other deterrents are more critical to start applying in some of the neuroscience research that's done. I know when I was in grad school, we're not asking about perceptions, worldviews, different ideologies. So that's one thing. The next thing I'll say is representation of samples. A lot of the time in neuroscience research that's been grounded on it, it's with white populations. And then as we've been talking about, you see non-white, but you have no clue what that actually entails. So I think if we do a better job at kind of meeting people where they are to get better representation, making science, making these opportunities more accessible and relatable to their experiences, I think that that can help kind of inform any type of research design from a neuroscience perspective. And then the last thing I'll just say with that too is very basic, but more qual work. Like I think with my experience as a user experience researcher, there is so much value into the words that people are actually saying. So we got to kind of take this lens off of just focusing on numbers. If we're only looking at percentages and only looking at numbers and whether those are statistically significant, I don't know what meaning is really driving that. That gives you the what, but not the why. So my point is, like, we need to do better at contextualizing the what, and that's where I think some qual things will come in and can help with that.
This always comes up for me when I think of neurofeedback research and the issues with instrumentation in neuroscience. And there's a fair amount of research that talks about, the lack of validity in measurements based on skin tone, and that certain biomeasures, they're just less accurate with darker skin tones. And I think that's an example where I think neuroscience is even more susceptible, because if we're doing neurofeedback research on a small sample size of predominantly white individuals, and then we're generalizing those findings to a broader, diverse population, and then we use the same instrumentation on a population that we don't even know if it's really a valid measurement of yet, like there's like 6 layers of holy shit in there that I'm like, why have we continued to do this? So if anybody wants to make some money and has entrepreneurial spirit, creating like actual reliable and valid biomeasures that can do the research with inclusive populations, I think that's a tremendous gap that I really only know of one person that even really talks about it. And I think it's in cardiac medicine. So if anybody ever wants to go that direction with me, let me know. I don't have that skill set, but would happily partner with someone. Henry, you were going to say something.
I'm finishing up a session of neurofeedback now, so I'll tell my person that, because she's interested in research. But anyway, so kind of back to how to be more inclusive. And this is just, I've been kind of spitballing on this because I just did my first, I'm coming on 1 year in the part-time program for the master's, but I'm going to be starting research, have a mentor, collaborator, another student stuff. And there is some research that needs to be done, and it's important for me to be inclusive. And I've thought about things like, so I'm going to be working with older transgender adults, and I want to reach not just white communities, because there's a lot of difference between how different cultures treat people who are different like this. And we're thinking of ways that we can reach the communities that, and I just think that it seems to me like, honestly, if you can get past the mistrust, which is, okay, maybe that's kind of flippant to say it like that, but if you can get trust, that you should be able to reach out to communities and get that data, shouldn't you? I mean, it just seems to me like, okay, when we do this, I should be able to reach out with connections to low SES, BIPOC, just different communities to get a better range and representation of people.
I think you bring up a good point, and I like giving this example. It may be a harsh one, but when people talk about trust and they say, well, if you would just go in, there's a lack of trust. And when I read it in the literature, it kind of throws it back on the populations. But if you take it from, and I'm not an evolutionary psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at evolutionary psychology, it states that populations or species adapt and they improvise because we're adaptable as a species. And if you think about it as humans, wouldn't the most adaptable feature be a mistrust of something that has done something to individuals from your species over a period of centuries or generations? If you think of like just a wild animal, like I'll just say a lion, which I don't know a lot about lions, but if a lion gets captured, I mean, and the lion, lions don't learn from that. And not species, but that family, whatever, is going to get wiped out, like that genealogy. So when you talk about trust, and I hear what you said about being flippant, I get that, but I think it goes deeper than that. It could, I look at that almost like an adaptability, like, why would I? Until I am able to be a part of the process. When I'm actually learning, I'm like, okay, and I think Dr. Purkey kind of mentioned this, but representation matters. And it's not mattering just because, hey, you got a Latino there. All right, representation matters. No, it's more of like, well, now that I see people such as myself in there, yes, but it's also an understanding that it is a place that is accepting of me, of my ideas, that I see it changing to be able to better adapt to what new ideas can come into. That's what makes diversity so strong. It's not because, hey, I got a white, black, I got an Asian here. I mean, we're all, it's all great. And it's like, well, yeah, that is great, but it's just not for what, right? It's also for the seeds planted, for the new information, the different perspectives that can be garnered from that. And so when you say that, it should be that simple. But a simple answer sometimes has a simple kind of response to it. And it's like, make it more open. You're going to have to change kind of the ideas of like white supremacy that go unquestioned. I think if you had that, then people would say, you know something, maybe you do have my best interest in mind. And I would just state this from a university perspective. And we talked about this in our article. You just cannot go into a community and then get your research study, then leave after 2 or 3 months. Because guess what? Maybe you did that, but maybe over the years, 5 other people have done that. And so then then you, which is the representative of the university, gets this reputation of you're just here to siphon off whatever we have and then leave. I don't see this bidirectional impact of us having an effect on you. When I say us, I mean the community. So I agree it should be, but it's a bidirectional pathway that needs undertaking and a very big self-awareness and self-revelation of the institutions or the people that constitute that to say, what are we doing? What have we done? And what are ways that we can do instead of looking at them like, you should trust us because we're the experts. So hopefully that makes sense.
I'm wondering if that would look like, because one of the things I want to do, and again, total newbie here, but like on some of that research, I want to ask questions that I mean, aside from the regular research questions, ask them like open-ended things like, what would you like to see, this or that? And and what you were just saying just now too is I know a lot of communities have LGBTQ plus centers, but what if leaving a part of us in the community would look like having more support, more of a support network or support system in place, if that makes sense. And
I'll tell you, and I don't want to dominate this conversation by any stretch, but I'll just state that from my experience, I'll give you an example of a colleague who, a Mexican descent, and works at a place on the border of Texas and Mexico. And I'm giving this example because what this individual did, their Spanish isn't that good. And so, but they went into communities and they humbled themselves to look what I would call silly, to understand how to make empanadas. I mean, and I know that seems minuscule and small, but it's that humbling of oneself. And this individual did it for years. I don't know about 8 years or anything like that, but it was years. So it was more than 1 year. And what I hear you stating, Henry, is how does that trust establish? And that trust is bidirectional, and it establishes by going into the community and having what I would call a bedrock there, as much as you can, a bedrock there, by coming consistently, by coming like humble, being humbled, by being okay to look stupid. Because in academia, I don't think we like to look stupid. And stupid can just be, I don't really know what to do right now. And that's okay. Like if I go into another culture, I'm just know I'm going to look stupid. And it could be my own culture, maybe a culture I'm unfamiliar with. But I think establishing that trust by being in there consistently, consecutively, by allowing them to teach you about what is going on, and then that's relayed and the importance of what has been taught. It's just like a counseling relationship. It takes time, but it is that vulnerability on both sides, not just expecting one side to be vulnerable. Sorry, I went off on a tangent, people, but yeah.
Something that's kind of came to my mind with this conversation and with Dr. Burt's remarks is being careful of a very thin line of tokenism in representation and what it means to actually do the research. So Dr. Burt had mentioned like not just going there, or, hey, I've checked off doing research with Black people, I've checked off doing research with Latinx, I've checked off research with all these other type of cultures, but really keeping in mind on what are the core values and how they're actually meeting the needs of the population that you want to address and help, rather than it being, is this for me just to, gain my knowledge and what that'll look like. So it's kind of like a tried and true statement, like walk a mile in my shoes, like pretty much the same kind of similar thought that comes to mind when we're thinking about representation and building that trust. So really being careful of holding on to tokenism, and that is important.
I couldn't help but think of a new operationalized term of scientific colonialism. I don't know if that's ever been written, but when I heard you say, Isaac, about going into the community, doing the research and leaving, like that's what I thought of. Like I thought of like toxic missionary culture and things like that that just go in and use a community for its resource, which is its story, its culture, and then you're going to be the one that tells that story through a research lens. And that's why I think part of the challenge too, and why I mentioned this to you, Henry, this idea of, I've seen people challenge even the term participants and like, or subjects in research, and kind of what does it mean to engage communities during the design of your study and have them included from from design to data collection to interpretation to publication, and what would it mean if that community was a co-researcher alongside of you. I think we do that in communities. We just don't always do it in research, which kind of, I think, is where maybe we were talking earlier, the line between what is like academic research and what is not academic research is changing, for good, hopefully, because, 25 years ago, if you tried to publish that, they'd probably say, no, 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 there's only 5 people in this study. What are you talking about? And now it's like, wow, there's like so much rich data here about these 5 people that there's a story to be told. And then we can see if it generalizes or not. But let's at least tell the story first, and not exclude those 5 people because they didn't meet a sample size or they were overshadowed by the 150 other people of a dominant culture, of a prescribed dominant culture into that sample. So I think that's what gets me excited about your future, Henry, is you're asking these questions as a student of kind of like, how are you going to do different? How are you going to do better? Because you'll learn from some of our mistakes, hopefully, and take that forward.
Thank you so much. I have to go pick up a youngling from school. So thank you so much. I really, really got a lot out of this. And I am going to really think a lot about all this. You guys are awesome.
Thank you all. I see Lynn, you're throwing out kind of, Lynn, do you want to bring that in the room? I don't want to take your words.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I was just reflecting on at this point in my life, kind of having been on both sides of it, having been someone who cares a lot about research and wants to try to find ways to do it better, but then also being part of more grassroots efforts or groups that are really, really trusted by very I don't know what the right word is, but communities who are otherwise have been really harmed by research, and so like getting hit up by academics to be the middleman, and how some of those have gone really, really well. I think there are ways to do that, and then sometimes it feels like it's actually gone really poorly, and we've kind of learned from that or made mistakes or been like, wow, we're really kind of just being asked to farm out the trust that people have in us as the group or the effort that's going on in the community, and it's really disheartening, and so it's difficult, and yeah, having been on both sides of that, and kind of using recognizable groups as like the first point of contact for academics who otherwise maybe don't have any other connections in that community. It's like sometimes that's the greatest first step, and sometimes it really does feel like like trying to capitalize on someone else's trust without offering really kind of any material reason to bring you into that trust that exists, right? So yeah, I don't know, it's complicated. Again, I don't have any answers, but sometimes it works out great and sometimes it really doesn't.
Now you got me thinking about the next talk, which is representation amongst the researchers, right? Because there's an assumption that the researchers are not a part of that group, right? So kind of maybe that's talk number 2 for a time to come as we think about those components. So Dr. Purkey, Burt, oh, go ahead, Laura, I'm sorry.
Yeah, quick question, Dr. Beeson, and it's about neurofeedback. When you do neurofeedback, you get information, and then you interpret that information. Is that right?
Something interprets that information. Sometimes it's clinician, sometimes it's a software package, sometimes it's both.
Okay, so that's the, I mean, there is what is like the stuff that just happened in the brain and you got a picture of it. And then there's the story that somebody makes up about it, which is, I think, what this whole thing has been talking about in a way.
Sure. I can see that parallel for sure. And there's a lot to unpack there because how it gets filtered, how it gets processed, who makes sense of it, there's so much in there, I think, Laura, but I think it's a nice parallel to our conversation. Data is just data. We got to make up a story around it, right? And who makes up that story is important. Who tells that story is important. Who creates the equipment that gets to get the data is important. I think all of those pieces play in. But Drs. Purkey, Burt, I want to give you all the final word. So what do you all want to leave the world with so we can solve this problem in the future of research? Go.
Be maverick scientists and practitioners. Maverick.
I think for me, might sound kind of cheesy, but always stay curious. Always stay curious, always challenge, always ask questions. I think that's the proponent of change.
Well, and as always, thank you all for promoting our curiosity and again, using articles as advocacy and as action too. And, it just takes us needing reminded over and over and over and over again. So I've built a new connection in Dr. Burt through this article that you all wrote, and now with Dr. Purkey as a new relationship through this article that you wrote. And I think that's all I ever ask for in an article is to build a new relationship because of it. So what if that was better than an impact factor? I don't know, maybe that's something we'll write about in the future. So take care, everybody. We'll see you next time. And thank you all once again.
Right.